My sister stood at the head of the conference table like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. She didn't look at me when she said it, she looked at the room. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice carrying that particular flatness she reserves for people she's already decided don't matter. Callista Ward is removed from the position of lead software architect. Her access credentials will be revoked by end of day. 43 people in that room. I counted them once, a long time ago, during a fire drill. 43 engineers, developers, project managers, and interns who all went completely silent at the same time. I sat at the far end of the table with my laptop open and my coffee still warm, and I thought, she actually did it. Not because I was surprised. I'd seen it coming for 3 weeks. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive are two entirely different things, and no amount of preparation makes the room stop spinning when your own sister looks past you like your furniture she's deciding whether to donate. Her name is Bridget. She's 38. She has our mother's cheekbones and our father's stubbornness, and she has been competitive with me since the day I was born, which she has never once admitted out loud, but which every single person in our family has known since approximately 1997. I'm 31. I built the system that runs this company's entire client-facing infrastructure, not metaphorically, literally. I wrote the first version in a rented room in Austin with a space heater pointed at my feet because the landlord hadn't fixed the heating yet. I brought it to Bridget's company, the company she'd be COO of for 2 years, as a partnership proposal. She hired me instead. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things that turned out not to be true. The conference room was still silent. Bridget finally looked at me. Her expression was the one she wears when she's already decided the conversation is over. "You're welcome to finish the week for transition purposes," she said. "HR will be in touch." I closed my laptop. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't do any of the things she was probably expecting, because I know my sister and I know she had a response prepared for every version of my reaction. Anger, she would have been calm and clinical. Tears, she would have been sympathetic in a way designed to humiliate. Argument, she would have cited the clause in my contract she'd had legal quietly revise 4 months ago. So I just closed my laptop and I looked at her and I said, "Understood." That was it. 2 syllables. And then something happened that I genuinely did not expect. To my left, our senior back-end engineer pushed his chair back from the table. His name is Fletcher, and he's been with the company for 6 years, and he does not make dramatic gestures. He stood up, picked up his notebook, and looked at Bridget. "I'll be submitting my resignation this afternoon," he said. "I've been meaning to for a while. This just clarified the timeline." Bridget blinked. Across the table, one of the junior developers, a woman named Opal who had joined 8 months ago straight out of Georgia Tech, also stood up. She didn't say anything. She just stood. Then 2 more. Then another. Then a project manager named Whit, who had driven 4 hours for this in-person quarterly review and had not said a single word during the meeting until this moment. By the time the movement stopped, 11 people were standing. Bridget said, "This is not the time or place." "With respect," Fletcher said, "it kind of is." No one sat back down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've told this story a few times now, and I always feel the pull to make myself sound more composed than I actually was. The truth is, I felt like the floor had shifted. Not in a bad way. In the way that happens when something you've been bracing against for a long time suddenly isn't there anymore and your whole body has to recalibrate. I picked up my bag. I stood up. I walked out. 11 people followed me into the hallway. Here is what my sister did not know when she fired me. She didn't know that I had been keeping records for 14 months. Not because I was planning anything. I want to be clear about that. I kept records because my therapist had told me, about 1.5 years ago, that I had a pattern of letting things slide and then being blindsided when those things accumulated into something catastrophic. She told me to start writing things down, so I did. Date, time, what was said, who was present. I kept it in a plain notes app on my personal phone, the same way I keep grocery lists and reminders to call my mother back. I did not know when I started doing this that it would ever matter. The first entry was from 14 months ago, a meeting in which Bridget told a client that the platform could handle functionality it could not in fact handle. Functionality I had specifically told her, in writing, was 18 months out at minimum. The client signed a contract based on that meeting. I flagged it internally. Nothing happened. The second entry was from 12 months ago. A budget review in which Bridget had routed $340,000 from the Infrastructure Development Fund into a marketing initiative she'd championed. The Infrastructure Development Fund was the fund that paid for the servers that ran my system. I had to delay 2 critical security updates because of that reallocation. I documented it. I sent an internal memo. The memo was acknowledged by one person and ignored by everyone else. By the time I reached the 12th entry, I had stopped being surprised. By the 20th, I had started understanding the shape of what was happening. Bridget was not just managing the company. She was managing the company in a way that systematically minimized any visible contribution that wasn't hers. She moved resources away from projects I led. She scheduled my presentations after lunch on days with heavy afternoon agendas when attention was lowest. She began referring to the platform in external communications as Bridget's system, not because anyone had told her to, but because no one had told her not to, and I had been too busy building the thing to pay attention to how it was being described. The firing was the logical endpoint of all of it. She'd been building toward it for over a year. I just hadn't been willing to see it until 3 weeks before it happened, when I overheard a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I had come back to the office late on a Tuesday to pick up a charger I'd left on my desk. The floor was mostly empty. Bridget's office light was on. Her door was cracked. She was on the phone, and she was using the voice she uses when she's talking to people she's trying to impress, and she was saying, "The transition will be clean. We've got enough internal documentation that anyone can maintain it." She made it more complicated than it needed to be, honestly. That's always been her thing. I stood in the hallway outside her office for approximately 45 seconds, then I walked to my desk, got my charger, and went home. That night I opened my notes app and I read every entry from the beginning. Then I called my friend Zinnia, who is an employment attorney, and I asked her if I could buy her coffee that week. Zinnia had read through everything by our second meeting. She set the pages down. I'd printed them out, which she said was either very organized or very paranoid and possibly both, and she looked at me across the coffee shop table and said, "This is not nothing." "I know," I said, "the contract amendment alone." She shook her head. "Do you understand what they did?" I understood. 4 months before the firing, Bridget had worked with legal to revise my employment contract. The revision had been sent to me as a routine update during a period when we were in the middle of a major product launch, and I was averaging 5 hours of sleep a night. I had skimmed it. I had signed it. The revision included a clause that significantly limited my intellectual property rights to work developed during my employment. Work including, notably, the platform I had built before I was technically employed by the company but had continued developing after. The original partnership proposal I'd brought to Bridget was still in my email, dated, timestamped, showing clearly that the core architecture predated my employment by 14 months. Zinnia tapped the stack of papers. "Do you have the original proposal?" "I have everything," I said. She nodded slowly. "Then we have a conversation to have with their board." I didn't go back to the office after the firing. I didn't need to. My personal projects were on my personal devices, and I had never, not once in 6 years, stored anything proprietary on company hardware. Again, not because I was planning this. Because I am a software architect, and I have opinions about data hygiene, and I have had those opinions since before I knew what nepotism was. Fletcher and I got coffee 2 days after the firing. He told me that the day after the meeting, Bridget had called a team-wide session to address the disruption and had explained my removal as a strategic restructuring decision. He said she had been calm and authoritative and had not mentioned that 11 people had walked out. "How did the room take it?" I asked. He wrapped both hands around his mug, like people who are updating their LinkedIn profiles. Opal had already accepted an offer somewhere else. 2 of the other engineers who'd stood up were in conversations with other companies. Whit, the project manager, had filed an internal HR complaint about the way the meeting had been handled. HR had acknowledged receipt of the complaint. The platform, meanwhile, was not doing well without me. I know how that sounds. I'm not saying it to be petty. I'm saying it because it is what happened and because it matters to the rest of the story. The system I'd built had layers, redundancies, custom configurations, architectural decisions that were documented in my head and in my notes, and, partially, in internal wikis that I had written, but that assumed a level of contextual knowledge that no one else at the company had yet developed. 3 weeks after my firing, the platform experienced a data sync failure that took 18 hours to resolve. I know this because Fletcher texted me. I know the details because he sent me the error logs, not because I asked, but because he was frustrated and needed someone who would understand. I understood. I did not reach out to Bridget. I did not reach out to the company. I let my attorney do that. Zinnia sent her letter on a Wednesday morning. I know this because she texted me when it went out, and I spent the rest of that day doing absolutely nothing productive. I reorganized my kitchen cabinets. I went for a run I wasn't dressed for. I called my mother and talked for an hour about nothing. The letter outlined three things: the IP discrepancy regarding the original platform architecture, the documentation I had compiled over 14 months, and the contract amendment and the circumstances under which it had been signed. It requested a meeting with the board within 10 business days. The company's general counsel called Zinnia the next morning. I was not in that call. I was in my apartment eating cereal at 11 a.m. and trying to read a novel, failing completely, reading the same paragraph 6 times. Zinnia called me afterward and told me what had been said, and I put the book down and sat very still for a while. The board had not been informed of the IP question. They had not been informed of the contract amendment. They had been told that my removal was a standard restructuring decision involving a performance and cultural fit evaluation. They had nodded and moved on to other business. They were not nodding now. The board requested an independent review. The review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I consulted on exactly nothing related to the company. Zinnia was clear that I should not, and I agreed, and I did other things instead. I had been sitting on an idea for about 2 years. A leaner version of the platform architecture I'd built, stripped of the enterprise-specific complexity, designed for mid-size companies that couldn't afford what the big players charged. I had notebooks full of it. I had a whiteboard in my second bedroom that had been covered in diagrams since before the firing. I had in fact been thinking about this in the abstract for so long that when I suddenly had both time and reason to make it concrete, the work came fast. Fletcher joined me 6 weeks after my firing. Opal came on as a contractor 2 weeks after that. By the time the board's review concluded, we had a working prototype and 3 letters of interest from companies I'd reached out to through my network. The review found, among other things, that the platform's original architecture had been developed prior to my employment. It found that the contract amendment had been presented under misleading circumstances. It found several of the budget decisions Bridget had made to be inconsistent with board-approved financial directives. Bridget was asked to step down from her COO role. The request was framed, as these things always are, as a mutual decision to transition leadership. She is no longer with the company. The company asked if I would consider a consulting engagement to stabilize the platform. I told them I would think about it. I did think about it for about 3 days, and then I called Zinnia and asked her what she thought. I think, Zinnia said, that you have a prototype and 3 letters of interest, and the company that just fired you is the 4th. I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. So that's a no, I said. That, she said, is entirely up to you. I declined the consulting engagement. The company hired an outside firm and spent, from what Fletcher heard through contacts still there, somewhere around $400,000 over 4 months getting the platform stable. That's more than my annual salary had been. I mention this not because I'm proud of the chaos. I'm genuinely not, but because there's a thing that happens when you spend years making yourself small in a space, convincing yourself that your presence isn't that significant, that you're replaceable, that the thing you built could easily exist without you. You start to believe it. I had believed it, on some level, for a long time. It takes something pretty stark to correct that particular piece of self-deception. Our company, mine, Fletcher's, Opal's, and eventually 2 others who came on in month 4, closed our first client contract 8 months after my firing. A regional healthcare network in the mid-Atlantic that had been quoted 3 times our price by an enterprise vendor. We were not the cheapest option. We were the option where someone who actually understood the system would pick up the phone. Our second client came through a referral from the first. Our third came through an article Opal wrote for a developer publication that somehow found its way to exactly the right inboxes. By the end of our first year, we had 6 clients and a waiting list. I have not spoken to Bridget since the morning she fired me. My mother asked me, around Thanksgiving, whether I thought Bridget and I would ever work things out. I told her I didn't know. That's the honest answer. I'm not carrying active anger anymore. I don't have room for it, and it was exhausting anyway. But I also don't know what a repaired relationship with her looks like, or whether the architecture of who we are to each other can hold the weight of what happened. What I know is this. I sat at that conference table and I let her strip the title and the access and the credential from me in front of 43 people, and I said understood, and I walked out with my head level and 11 people stood up and followed me, and I had no idea any of them would do that. I think about that sometimes. What it took for Fletcher to push his chair back, what it cost him to do that in real time, with no plan, with no guarantee of what came next. He did it anyway. Opal did it. Whit did it. People I had worked alongside for years, some of them, and people I barely knew, and they all made the same calculation in the same moment and came down on the same side. I didn't build the new company alone. I didn't survive the last 2 years alone. And I didn't walk out of that conference room alone, even though the only person I'd been counting on in that room was myself. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the board review, not the IP settlement, not the client list or the waitings list or any of it. Just 11 people standing up. Just that.